Now let us start our seminar, Modern Monetary Theory and Green New Deal. Hi, my name is Myung-sub. I'm a student from SMU Law School and I moderate this seminar. Since the term Green New Deal became popularized as a solution for the ongoing climate crisis, the usual question of how we pay for it has been brought up by many. A school of economic thought called Modern Monetary Theory, MMT, which suggests that we can't always pay for massive government programs like Green New Deal, has become popularized too. It now occupies the center of economic policy sphere, at least in the US, in that in July, US Congress actually passed a House resolution condemning MMT. One interesting aspect of MMT is that it is not just an economic theory, but also a legal theory of money. What is the relationship between money and law? What is the nature of fiscal policy? And can we really do Green New Deal? These important questions lie ahead of us. To talk about these issues, joining us now from Oregon, America is Professor Rohan Grey. Professor Rohan Grey is an assistant professor of law at Willamette University School of Law. Originally from Australia, he practiced law in New York City, focusing on family law. His research focuses on the legal design and regulation of money and finance, as well as broader issues of law and political economy. Most importantly, he has contributed to the establishment and dissemination of modern monetary theory. He wrote many articles which appeared in The Nation and Financial Times. Welcome, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
Could you first talk about how you've been doing this week? There has been a series of historic wildfires in the West Coast, millions of acres of forests burned. We've seen grim scenes coming from Bay Area where sky turned literally orange. I heard that in Oregon, 500,000 people had to evacuate. I think you felt a lot about this conflagration since Australia too experienced this kind of massive wildfires in January.
Yeah, I mean, this area, when we first moved here, one of the things I noted when we first, were exploring the neighborhood was just how beautiful and green everything is, and how this area is known for having a lot of rain. But at the moment, a significant fraction of the whole state of Oregon is on fire or is covered in smoke, and the average safety of sort of particles of smoke is around sort of 50, and it's been up around 500 in Portland and the nearby area, making it the most smog-covered city in the world by a significant amount. So it's been pretty dangerous, and already California is quite sort of famous for having annual fires. So I believe, in fact, Oregon had actually sent some of its firefighters down to California to help before this, but now have to recall them and are facing just a complete shortage of equipment and people across both states. And from what I have been reading, this is going to continue and get worse in the future. Yeah. And in Australia, we have had record level fires in the last few years as well. And I think once again, this is coming in countries that are not even acknowledging the level of climate crisis that we have, even as the actual environmental things that we're experiencing are getting more and more extreme. So I'm not sure how much longer people can pretend that nothing is changing when they're seeing this outside in such a catastrophic way.
Speaking of Australia, I think what's interesting about your background is that, as I said, you're Australian and you became lawyer in America, and that you are a professional musician and taught music at public schools. How you ended up being a lawyer in America who deals with money and finance? Please talk about yourself a little bit.
Sure. Well, my mother is a music teacher and my father is a lawyer, so I am not very original in having become a music teacher and a lawyer. I don't think you need to be a psychiatrist to work that one out. But I had always been interested in international issues. I studied Japanese and spent time living in Japan growing up a little bit. And when you live in Australia, you're always looking out to the rest of the world. And I think it was always of interest to me, the things that were happening internationally. So when I went to college, I did an exchange program in the United States and I stayed there. And I was always interested in going to law. And originally I wanted to work in international law. And when I got to the United States, I thought, well, New York has one of the best international law kind of expertise in the world. So that was the place that I wanted to study law. As I got into becoming a lawyer, I ended up realizing that I was interested in other areas that were also domestic. So I practice family law, which is very local, very, very local. But now the work that I do, once again, is about the design of mostly digital currency, and I'm looking at it in the context of international finance and international sort of legal design. So I think, once again, I'm back to international kind of issues, but it makes more sense to work on those issues from the United States than it does to work on them from Australia. So this is my home now.
Well, that's very interesting. Well, now let's move on to our main topics. Speaking of money, as I said, MMT has a legal basis, which is the legal theory of money. But recalling what I and many of us here have learned, I don't think we've actually never dealt with money in our classes. Like, I don't know whether like, for instance, in contract law class, we simply don't talk about money. And even in banking law class, which I actually took, what we learn is that legal tender, the specific terminology, means paper money, and that's it. So I think your answer will be very helpful for a lot of us. So what is the relationship between money and law?
Yeah, I think the first thing to note is that there is a legal history of money. Because monetary instruments are by definition legal instruments, so a currency note is a liability. There's an obligation of the issuer. A bank deposit is a credit obligation of the bank. A security is a securitized obligation. All of these things have a legal form, so it is impossible to talk about how money works and where it comes from without thinking about it in legal terms. Even kinds of money historically that were based or grounded in a physical token or a commodity like gold or something like that. Even those things were still governed by laws that affected not only the valuation, so how many dollars for a certain amount of that commodity, but also the rules of property and the rules of contract and the rules of accounting. All of those systems actually give money its value. But it makes sense that a lot of you haven't experienced it, because I didn't have much exposure to the law of money until I went to look for it myself. And I started getting interested in this around 2010, right after the global financial crisis. And it was at a time when I think a lot of lawyers had not been focusing on macroeconomic issues. If you look in the American legal literature for the words law and macroeconomics, between sort of 1970 and 2010, there were maybe 5 or 10 things written in 40 years. Now it's a whole vibrant new field. And the law of money is also a vibrant field that has everything from history to administrative law to constitutional law to private law. But it is a response to the new world that we are living in, where the global financial crisis showed how important those aspects of the global economy are. And I think it is also helped by the fact that, thanks to modern technology, it is easier for people working in different areas to learn from each other. So for a long time, I think a lot of lawyers listened to economists about this, and the economists said that money is a veil, it is neutral, it is just a layer over underlying real economic relations. But after the global financial crisis, I think a lot of lawyers started to read elsewhere, to read historians and anthropologists and sociologists, and they realized that there was a lot more to money, and as a result, lawyers could not stay out of the conversation. So this is, I think, a brave new world for lawyers to take these issues seriously, and I think with both the macro issues around the world, the global financial crisis, COVID, climate change, and the technology issues, everything around fintech and cryptocurrencies and those kinds of technologies have helped lawyers understand that this is a topic to take seriously, and not simply to repeat what they may have learned in their undergraduate economics as true and as something that is true before law, rather than true through law, which means lawyers have to think about it too.
Where does the theory you just explained take place in MMT, and what is MMT?
Yeah, so so the first thing is that MMT is a theory of work, a theory in the sense that it is a school of thought with different components. And one of the components looks at the history of money. And it says that the historical story that you will read in an economics textbook, that money came from barter, where it was simply a more convenient commodity to trade, is not accurate. It is not true historically. That did not happen historically. What actually happened historically, and this is a position or an interpretation that is supported by historians and anthropologists and the legal historians specifically, is that there would be a political community, and that political community would want to govern itself, often with a governing class or a warlord or a king or a priest, sometimes a democracy, and it would govern itself by bringing resources to the center, to the administrative unit. Sometimes that would be a temple, sometimes that would be a state, sometimes that would be something else. And the way that it would then allocate those resources among people in the community was part of its governance. So if you were an elder or if you were more powerful, you got more of the resources. And in order to do that, over time, it became easier to, instead of saying, this person should give me these resources, this person should give me these resources, instead of saying that, they would say, we will impose a tax on everybody, and then they will need to earn whatever it requires to pay the tax. Even if the thing to pay the tax has no value, even if it's just a stick of wood or a piece of paper, they will need to earn this to pay the tax. So we can buy real things, the things that we wanted, in exchange for money that people then need to pay their taxes. So in that story, unlike the normal story you hear in an economics textbook, money doesn't evolve naturally from private actors. It comes from public governance and public law. Also, the point of money is not for the government, is not to then earn more money, because it's the one that creates the money. The point of the monetary system for the government is to acquire the real resources that they can get for giving money to people, so that people then have to pay their taxes and other things. And some people, I think, often hear that concept and they think of the state. So they think that money has to be the state. And often MMTs will say it is a theory of state money. But I think it's probably more accurate to say it's a legal theory, because you do not have to be in the position of the king or in the position of the government to have an impact on that system. Just like with law, there are actors that are in a position of authority, like the courts, like the legislatures, but that does not mean that average people cannot have an impact on how the law works. Not just bringing a court case, but even things like being disobedient and refusing to obey the law, or interpreting the law in a way where they refuse to enforce the law. And all those ways that people make the law, even in the United States, for example, during the era of slavery, slaves actually helped make the law and demand rights and used the legal system against itself, because the law was its own system. And so what money being a creature of law means that, yes, there is obviously a big component that is about power and the state, but it is not just the state. It is anybody who can affect legal change. And Martin Luther King, for example, famously said, I am fighting for rights that have not been recognized yet. And so if money is a creature of the state, it belongs up there. If money is a creature of law, it belongs to anybody who claims justice as their own language.
Then what does MMT suggest about government spending and government expenditure?
Yeah, so MMT would say that because it is the state that creates the need for money, that it is the state that puts you in a position of unemployment. That is to say, a state where you need to earn money to survive. And as a result of that, it is reasonable to say that the state is responsible for addressing unemployment. And the way that MMT says to do that is very simple, which is you can pay people to do work. And as long as the state can pay people to do work, it can address the unemployment that it itself creates, that the state creates by putting people into a world where they need to earn money to survive. So if I had a magical resource where everybody needed to drink it or they would die every day, and I had as much of it as I wanted, I could make infinity amounts of this liquid. If I did not give it to people and then they died, that would be my fault. And so from an MMT point of view, if you understand that the state creates money, then you also understand that the state can choose who can get money and who doesn't. And that is the way to understand unemployment in a monetary system. Now, what it says about government spending is, we often think of government spending as coming from the taxpayers' money, because the way that you would normally think of it, if you and I need money, we need to get it from someone else. But the state creates the money. And as I said earlier, the point of the taxes is to take the money back so that there's money taken back out of the system again. If I say you have to pay 100 and then I give you 100 so you can, and you give me your labor, the tax takes that 100 back so that I can do it all over again. And so taxes are sucking money back out when government spending is putting it in. So we might think of government deficits as bad, but an MMT perspective would say every time the government runs a deficit, somebody else runs a surplus. So we cannot think of the government's deficit as being our deficit. We have to think of the government's deficit as being on one side and then there being someone else on the other side. And the same thing with the national debt. Some people think of the national debt as something that we owe to somebody else. And there is a bit of a funny cartoon that I like that said, CNN just said that the world is $600 trillion in debt. Well, who do we owe? Jupiter? And so the point of that joke is we owe it to ourselves. Wherever one person has a debt, someone else has an asset. And the only question is whose debt and whose assets are the most safe. And the government's debt is always the safest because it can always pay it back. But even more importantly, money itself is a debt. Like I said earlier, it is a contract. It is a legal note saying, I promise to give this person $100. So if you take a $100 bill to the bank, they will give you two $50 bills. If you take $100 of government debt and say, I want this redeemed, they will give you two $50 bills. So if you're holding $100 of government debt and you're holding $100 of currency, and they both are functionally the same except for maybe the interest rate, then we are thinking of debt and money as something that is very different when in fact they are the same.
A lot of people would respond to what you've just said with like, oh, look, Venezuela, Weimar Republic, Zimbabwe, that's what happened when you just print money and run deficit. While it would be just ludicrous to simply compare any country with these places where specific political and international situations led to hyperinflation, inflation is indeed a serious issue we should always consider when we talk about macroeconomy. What are the solutions for inflation that MMT recommends?
Yeah, the first thing to think about is what kind of inflation we are talking about. Because often people think of inflation as just a objective thing that we can see. But in reality, before we even know what kind of inflation we're talking about, the question of what we're measuring becomes very important. And so often when we talk about inflation, we are talking about a specific set of prices, an index of prices related to food and other consumer goods. Related to certain kinds of consumer goods, sorry. But food is often not included, and neither is oil. And a whole range of financial assets are not included. So even when we start talking about inflation, we are already talking about only a very narrow set of prices. Maybe those prices could stay still and others could go up and down. And we would think oh, inflation is still. So we are already not even talking about a term that is clear. But when we look at inflation, there are different things that can cause inflation. What most people think is the only cause of inflation is too much demand. And the way that most people think of that coming up is if you create too much money, you will have too much demand. But that isn't true. How people spend money can affect demand. But for example, if you give someone $1 million and then they put it under their bed, it doesn't do anything to prices. If you give $1 million to people and they pay debts that they already owe, that may not do anything to prices either. If you give people $1 million and that helps companies sell more things that they otherwise would have sold and keep their factory running, that might actually not cause inflation either, because productivity will just increase in response. The other thing to understand is that I would claim throughout most of the 20th century, and certainly for the 21st century, most countries around the world are not dealing with the problem of too much demand. They are dealing with the problem of too little demand. So it is like worrying about freezing to death when there are fires outside. It is the wrong problem that we are facing right now. But there are also sources of inflation that have nothing to do with public spending. One source is private demand. So private credit, private finance, private banking. Those sources of demand can be as inflationary as public spending. But we never talk about them in the same context. So if, for example, we were reaching a productive limit to the economy where we had every single person employed and we were pursuing very, very good investments, in that moment, if somebody said, I want to do another big round of public spending, it might still be possible to do that without inflation if you reduce the amount of private credit activity going on. The last thing to note here is that there are kinds of inflation that have nothing to do with demand at all and have everything to do with markets and power and the pricing set by firms. So for example, when you look at where prices are formed, a lot of businesses do not say they form their prices based on the Federal Reserve's interest rates or the unemployment rate in the economy. They form their prices based on how much their input costs are and how much of a markup they can get away with selling their goods at that will still allow them to sell enough to be worth selling. And so that question of markup power becomes a question of if you are the only entity in a market, or if you have a special relationship with the government, or if you are very good at, getting around regulations. All of those things could matter, but also things as basic as the legal design of intellectual property. There was a very famous court case in America called Eldred that went to the Supreme Court in, I think it was 2001, or maybe it was 2003. And it was a case about the limits of copyright. And the Supreme Court said it was okay to extend the limits of copyright by a number of years that Congress had extended it. And people had argued in that case that it was too long and it was unconstitutional and it wasn't helpful. But because of that, the value of many, many intellectual property assets, for example, the entire of Disney, perhaps, is worth a lot more money. That money did not come from productivity. It came from a change in the legal system. And we see that today all over the place with things like data, where it is not productivity that is creating value. It is the legal rules that allow people to take data and use that data however they want to. So if we are to understand inflation properly, which I think is very important and agree with you, we need to start by asking what kind of inflation and how can we address it? And as you noted, most of those examples of hyperinflation had nothing to do with too much demand. They had to do with a breakdown in society, a breakdown in the production system, a breakdown in government and law enforcement, and then the money printing and the money spending happened as a response. And yes, it made it worse, but it was not the money printing that caused the problem. If I got, for example, shot with a gun and then I drank a bottle of wine, it may be that the bottle of wine would make me worse and make me more sick because it wasn't a good thing to do when I was already shot with a gun. But that doesn't mean that drinking a bottle of wine killed me. It means that being shot killed me. And then I did something that didn't make it better. So when we think about those examples of hyperinflation, it is really important to point the finger at where the real problem was. And the real problem was in Zimbabwe, that the farming system completely collapsed. The real problem in Germany was that the rural region was taken away, and then the labor movements collapsed production, and there was a breakdown in government. The real problem that we saw in Venezuela was that the country had been basically reliant on commodity exports, and the price of that commodity collapsed. It was not to do with productivity. It was not to do with them being at full employment and pushing spending too far. It was none of those things. It was a very different problem. It needed a different solution.
Another aspect I think we should talk about is international trade. Like, while Korea is a currency issuing country and thus have a full control over its currency, it's arguably in a different position than the US due to its role in international trade, which is a trade surplus nation that has benefited from what we call free trade. Expanding money supply can arguably lead to serious issues like balance of payments and exchange rates, undercutting Korean export, which may lead to lower growth and higher unemployment. Of course, we can think about expanding consumption as the source of growth, but this kind of transition is likely to be very disruptive and hard to implement. Can countries like Korea, the export-oriented ones that may face serious balance of payments issues, run economy with an MMT understanding of economy?
Yeah, so the first thing is MMT is a way of understanding things. So understanding the monetary system and its limits better will help you manage the economy better. That doesn't mean you might do exactly the same thing in Korea that you would do in America. But if I can play an instrument, I can play lots of different pieces of music on that instrument. The important thing is knowing how to play the instrument. So with MMT, it's teaching you how to understand and use the monetary and financial system. How you use that knowledge is very different. But even understanding those things will help you not make very important mistakes. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there are policy prescriptions that a lot of MMTers would say are a good idea, or that people would say follows logically from the things that MMT shows to be true. For example, providing a guaranteed job to everybody. And the MMT argument is that that would be very good, not just because it would be good for people morally, but it would be good for economic productivity because you would reduce all of the damage and bad economic effects of unemployment, and you would get the benefits of the output that would come from that model. More importantly, when it comes to thinking about development, I'm not sure I agree with you that pursuing an export-led growth model forever is a good idea. I'm not sure if you meant to say that, but I think when it comes to export-led growth, one thing that MMT can help you understand is that exports, in a very narrow sense, are a real resource transfer in exchange for money. So Korean workers will produce things or improve things that they have imported and then sell them, and other people will give money in exchange for that labor and those real resources. Now, in certain contexts, what that means is that Korean workers and people in Korea are not enjoying all of the economic benefits of their own labor. They are accumulating claims on the rest of the world or accumulating funds. And maybe that is a strategically smart thing for in that moment. Maybe it isn't. But that as a general strategy overall, it has to be reducing the consumption living standards of people in Korea. So if it is possible in the future to have all the benefits that people think come from the current economic development strategy, without that export-led component, then that would probably be the best outcome, because then people in Korea get to enjoy the benefits fully of what they consume. And we see this in other export-led countries. So for example, Germany has been export-led economy for quite a while, but as a result, German workers are not getting paid as much as they're actually producing. So when it comes to Korea, the first thing I would say is you can make better policy decisions if you understand the monetary and financial system better. The second thing is you can certainly get to full employment, and you can certainly think about how to reframe current budget conversations away from the idea that every dollar has to be paid for, so that you can talk about the things that are important. That might not mean that you spend every single thing forever, but it does mean that you know where the limits are and you can talk properly about those limits. But my view when it comes to the growth strategy is that trade is important, but for the monetary system's sort of point of view, it is less important than your financial position, because trade is often a small part of the overall financial flows. And controlling the financial flows in your economy is very important. I am a supporter of capital controls and other things. I don't think liberalized trade flows are the best solution there. Liberalized financial flows are the best solution there. And I think a lot of countries, including Korea, learned that lesson in the 1990s and have built up a reserve as a result to avoid being subject to the worst of liberal trade flows. But it is precisely for the reason that you mentioned, that Korea is not the United States, that I think it's very important to understand the global financial system as a hierarchical system. And what that means is, if you are not the United States, you want to have access to the United States liquidity. And the way that countries have done that since 2008 was the central bank swap line system. And the central bank swap line system was originally 6 countries. It was Canada, the United States, United Kingdom, Japan, Switzerland, and the ECB, which is not a country, but you know. And you don't have to be think very hard to realize that those countries have things in common culturally as well as just economically. This was a community of Europeans and Americans for themselves, basically, and then Japan as a kind of American satellite. But this time around with COVID, there was a much wider number of countries that were eligible for swap lines. I think Korea was, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, please.
And the terms on which those swap lines are available, in my opinion, is the most important question in international trade and finance. You may have the best export-led growth policy for your country you could ever possibly have. And if the United States does not give you access to that system in a crisis, you will suffer. So I don't think you can do it alone, but I also don't think the solution is to just try and export your way out of it. I think the solution is we have to acknowledge globally that the United States liquidity system is the new Bretton Woods. Who gets those swap lines under what conditions is the new international financial regime. We have not understood it that way yet. And it is a very interesting topic of law because it is such a soft area of law. Often those decisions get made with 2 pages of text. They aren't discussed in Congress. They take place behind the closed doors of the Federal Reserve. But those questions are, in my opinion, the most important questions of international trade and finance today is who gets the swap lines for what?
Well, thanks for your very detailed answer to my questions. Now let's move on to our next topic, Green New Deal. Now it's widely accepted that there must be a massive government spending to decarbonize our economic system, and many governments are pursuing their own initiatives. Indeed, in Korea, the government too touted Green New Deal, but the outstanding budget dedicated to renewable energies and decarbonization is so minuscule that many activists called it farce or too inefficient, too small. What do you think Green New Deal should mean, and how MMT can help us implement Green New Deal?
Yeah, I think the activists at the Sunrise Movement have done an excellent job, and leaders like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have done an excellent job articulating the core aspects of a Green New Deal. And I think one of the core aspects of it is a commitment to solutions that meet the scale of the crisis. And that means being realistic, that if you believe the science is correct, that we have so many years to fix things, and you propose a solution that does not meet that scale, you are not being serious. The second thing is what a Green New Deal actually means. I think it requires a fusing of three different things. One is concern for sustainability and the climate. One is concern for workers, because for a lot of history, environmentalism was seen to be against labor. Environmentalism killed jobs. Labor liked jobs. Labor doesn't like environmentalism, right? That was a lot of human history, and it made an alliance very difficult in the 20th century. And I think the Green New Deal started from day one saying this was going to be a job forward transformation. And so what the Sunrise Movement folk have said from day one is that a job guarantee and good jobs, good paying jobs that help the planet have to be available for everybody. And that has to include, the third point is a just transition. That means the people who are the most affected by climate change, that includes people in vulnerable communities, so people in areas that are going to be affected. I would have said, Indonesia because it's lots of islands, but I guess I can say Portland now because we are also affected. But Australia is also affected, and everywhere else that's going to be experiencing increasingly severe environmental problems. But it also means frontline workers. So people in industries that might need to close, or that industries that might need to change. So making sure that those people are not left behind. And lastly, it means, and maybe most importantly, that any of these big changes have to be designed and approached in a way that ensures the most marginalized voices are given the prominence. And what that means is, in the past, when we had big macroeconomic movements like in the 1930s, they often focused on the most privileged groups first. So labor, even when labor was powerful, it often meant white men first, and then others second. And what this Green New Deal movement is saying is, no, it needs to be people of color, it needs to be women, it needs to be disadvantaged communities who are first. Because if they aren't first, they won't just be last, they won't even be included at all. And those three components are, to me, what a Green New Deal is. It has to be scientific, it has to be forward-looking. That means it must actually say there will be an economy tomorrow. It won't be the same as the past, but we aren't just killing jobs for the sake of killing jobs. And it needs to be just and fair and target the most vulnerable.
While there is a consensus on the need for a Green New Deal, there is also a growing recognition that the continuous growth, economic growth, caused by the growth of material and energy consumption is impossible in this physically limited planet. Can MMT or any other economic theories pursuing arguably full employment and mobilization of resources and economic growth be compatible with the environmental sustainability and the so-called limits to growth imposed by our system?
I think that's a great question, and I think the answer is yes, obviously, which is why I'm here. But the reason is that MMT helps us understand that nominal growth of money numbers, is different from real resource growth. And just to give a very simple example, if I created an economy where the only things that people produced were massages, jokes, and music, singing, that's it. They did it with their hands, they did it with their mouth, and nothing else. We could have a monetary system in that economy with markets and firms and banks and everything else. But the only things people would be consuming would be things that cost basically no real resources. In that world, you might have very high GDP growth, but not very high real resource growth. And so I think what MMT allows us to understand is, yes, there are real resource limits on what we can do in the economy, but that is not the same as nominal limits on economic growth as understood in terms of money numbers. What we need to do, in my view, is transform the economy underneath those numbers. So those numbers mean something different. And there are a lot of kinds of work that are green, not just things that are actively repairing the environment, but things that are very low energy and carbon intensive. And those are the things that we need to move towards further. So to go back to your earlier question about export-led growth, and you were talking about consumption as an alternative driver, one of the things about that is that there are certain things that people can consume in person in your own country that might be very low energy that you can't necessarily export in the same way. Childcare, elder care, community care. These are things that could be very low carbon, but also very high quality of life improving. And we could have very high GDP growth in those sectors, even as we see dropping economic, real resource consumption all over the place. So I think it's important to separate out nominal versus real resource dynamics. The second thing is that when you understand that jobs do not come from private employers, right? Jobs first and foremost come from public spending. That helps us understand that we do not need to use private market-based productivity metrics as the way to determine whether a job is worth doing or not worth doing. And so things that may be quote unquote inefficient from a market point of view might be extremely efficient from a sustainability point of view. There is a famous line with Milton Friedman where he said, I think it was Milton Friedman, where someone was talking about why do we make them dig holes with shovels? And he said, oh, because it creates more jobs than doing it with a tractor. And he said, well, if that's the case, why don't we give them a spoon? Because then it will be even more jobs, right? And that sounds silly when you say it like that, right? Oh, why would you ever do something with a spoon if you could do it with a tractor? But the answer is that if the tractor costs 10,000 times as much carbon, then maybe using a shovel in that situation is better than using a tractor, right? If you are only looking at it in terms of market efficiency, it might not be. If you are looking at it in terms of ecological sustainability, it may be. So a job guarantee allows us to think about the value of work and the cost of work very differently than when we think of work as coming from markets and requiring efficiency. So if people sometimes say, well, wouldn't the job guarantee work be inefficient? Well, if efficiency means destroying the planet, maybe it should be inefficient.
Thanks for your detailed answers. Now let's move on to our Q&A session. And I've got one question from chatting, which says that if Green New Deal is based on MMT, the consequence of Green New Deal might be regional disparity, inequality in terms of environment. So if such an inequality happens, what should we do?
I mean, I think the starting point is to recognize that's what's going to happen anyway, right? America has 200 military bases around the world. It isn't going to give them up anytime soon. So when it comes to inequality, we can be sure that whatever global response the Federal Reserve does, it is going to put America's first whenever it can. That's a bad thing in my view. I'm not an American, I'm an Australian. But I think the way we need to address that is to understand what it means to have monetary power. And so if, for example, a number of countries in South America decide that they are too small to effectively compete against the United States or the European Union or India or China, but that they are stronger together. But they don't want to make the mistake of the European Union and create a central bank without a political union, right? So that they actually make their situation worse economically. If people are in that position, an understanding of MMT might help you design a regional intercurrency system so that you can have a combination of the benefits of being more unified without becoming locked in to a single currency the way that the European Union did. That's just one example. But the other thing is, when it comes time to working out what the limits are with the Green New Deal, we have to focus on the ones that are real and not the ones that are not real. The things that are fake are a distraction. So if somebody comes to you and says, we should design the Green New Deal like this, and the reason we should do it that way is because it doesn't add to the deficit, that is not the right question. The right question should be, what are the effect of spending? And if the effect of running a bigger deficit is good, then that's actually a bad approach to say it doesn't add to the deficit. Maybe you want to add to the deficit in that moment. So we need to be asking the right questions before we can even design the Green New Deal the right way. And I think what MMT helps us understand is there are certain things that are real problems and there are certain things that aren't real problems. It doesn't presume to have the answer for every real problem, but it does help us know the difference between the real ones and the fake ones. But when it comes to regional inequality, my view is the only way to deal with that is to build countervailing power. So having regional blocks that are sufficiently strong to counter these large dominant players or be enough of an equal player, but also to realize this is the problem. The problem is that the swap line system is imperialistic. That is the problem. So we cannot sit there and say the problem is that our export-led growth strategy isn't good enough. It doesn't matter how good your growth strategy is. What matters is the American international financial system.
I've got another question, which says that while you said that when it comes to inflation, what matters is the way we spend, not the currency issuance, I don't think that means that MMT is free from the limitation posed by the equation of exchange in the long run. Is there any aspect in MMT which shows that we need to collect excess currency and to delete the excess currency?
Can you explain the last bit of that question again?
Is there any part of MMT which says, like, or as a euphemism or in a real way, which suggests that we have the way we collect excess currency, like, or
oh,
yeah.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. So on the second question, it depends the kind of instrument you're talking about. But normally, as you mentioned earlier, when you study legal tender in law school, you're talking about it as the piece of paper. But the vast majority of dollars issued by the United States or whatever else currency issued by other countries is not in the form of paper money. It's in the form of bank balances at the central bank. And so if you pay your taxes through your bank account, what happens in accounting terms is your deposits at your bank go down. Your bank has reserves with the central bank. Those reserves go down. And then those reserves go up at the Treasury's account. So if you looked at it from that level, you would see, oh, it went down, but then it went up somewhere else, so it didn't disappear. But if you zoom out, if you look back one bit, the Treasury and the central bank are together. They are not separable because the central bank issues liabilities backed by the same government that the Treasury is part of. And the assets that the central bank holds are Treasury liabilities, are Treasury debt. And so there is a relationship between the Treasury and the central bank there where at one level, they're different entities. But at a higher level, they're both parts of the government. So to give an example, if the Department of Education chose to sell 1,000 chairs to the military, there would be an accounting relationship there. right? There would be a sale from the military department and a purchase from the Department of Education. But from the perspective of the whole government, nothing changed. The private sector did not get anything more. It all happened internally. Just like if you're at a company, you might have different divisions and they might have accounting between each other, but they're still part of the same company. So when you look at that paying taxes moment that we just described, on one hand, you can see it, those dollars appear in the Treasury's account. But on the other hand, the minute it leaves the private sector, it's just all internal accounting within the government. The Treasury could say it has an infinity dollars. The Fed could say it has an infinity dollars. It does not matter. It's all internal numbers. They do not mean the same things as the numbers held by people outside of the government.
Well, another question is that is the legal theory of money of MMT based on other political philosophy, that of Rawls or Dworkin, or has gained inspiration from those scholars' political philosophy?
I won't speak for other scholars, but I don't get much personally out of Rawls or Dworkin. What I do get is the legal realists from the American legal realist tradition, I think are an important influence. And there are certain legal historians who have done important legal historical work about money as a legal institution. And they aren't MMT people, but they would consider themselves, I think, fellow travelers, people working in the same general direction. And they would probably agree with 95% of MMT, even if they might disagree on some of the differences. But when I say they agree, I mean they agree on the parts that MMT says is new and different. So when it comes to the legal history of money, I think there are a lot of scholars working in that field now, or related fields, law and finance, fintech. Some banking scholars I do think get it, but I understand a lot of them don't talk about it. And legal historians, law and macroeconomics, law and sociology. A lot of people in that area are all talking about money. But I think those would be more important influences than the philosophers, because I don't think MMT is a purely political philosophy. It is in part a theory based on real world understanding. That is to say, it probably has some relationship to pragmatic philosophers, maybe John Dewey or someone like that, in the sense that you need to understand these things in relation to real economic systems. And one of the reasons MMT, for example, always talks about a floating currency with a floating exchange rate is because it is a very different universe if you are talking about a fixed exchange rate to a floating exchange rate. There are things that might be true of both, but there are things that are very, very different. And we could imagine, just to give an example, if there is physics might be the same across the universe, but if you're in a solar system with two suns, it will be very different to a solar system with one sun. Right? How the physics works there might be very different. So that understanding of real world context is, I think, where MMT starts.
Another question is, in which part of the established academic discipline do you find your research belong to? Put more succinctly, do you consider yourself a lawyer or an economist or a participant in an environment movement? This question seems to me crucial in a sense that your work should find a place in the academia and persuade the public in the academia.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I studied a little bit of political economy in undergraduate, but I don't ever call myself an economist. And when I do work on economics, the work that I do is usually about the institutional or legal aspects of those issues, or it is working in collaboration with economists. When I set up my nonprofit called the Modern Money Network, it was designed to be interdisciplinary. So we have people in that community who are lawyers, we have economists, we have historians, we have sociologists, we have people in the humanities, in media and culture and the English department. And so what we are trying to do there is learn from whoever is most useful to understand this. And some of my personal research is around digital currency technologies. And to understand that, I spend a lot of time reading technologists and legal scholars of technology and society and the relationship between the two. And that doesn't have anything to do with MMT necessarily. But when I take that idea and I take MMT and I put it together, then I have some new things that I can say about money. So my first big law review article that was published recently was called Administering Money, Coinage, Fiscal Debt Crises, and the Future of Fiscal Policy. But it involved constitutional law, it involved administrative law, it involved questions about law and macroeconomics. I am currently co-organizing the 3rd Law and Macroeconomics Conference next month. So there are these new areas of law, whether it's legal history, constitutional theory of money, law and finance, law and macro, where there's space to do this work. But because I also consider myself sort of involved in politics, I will work with others to build a cross-disciplinary movement and to talk to popular movements and to write op-eds in the media. And part of what MMT tries to do, which is I think why it causes some confusion to people, is it is talking to different groups of people at the same time. On one level, it's talking to economists. One level, it's talking to other academics and scholars. On one level, it's talking to the public. On one level, it's talking to journalists, which is a very different language. And on one level, it's talking to politicians. And so all of those different contexts need different styles and different approaches. Some want more details, some want less details, some want more politics, some want more description. And you have to balance them all.
I think this would be one of the 2 final questions, which is that recently the issue of wealth disparities have been politicized, especially the idea of levying large taxes on the top percentile. Does MMT have particular views on tax policies?
Well, again, I think there are a lot of people in the MMT community that might agree with a certain way of thinking, but I don't think that's the same as it's intrinsic in MMT. What MMT as a theory would help us understand is 2 things I think that are important. One is the point of imposing taxes is not to get the money. The point of imposing taxes is to take away the money, right? And so the question then becomes, why are you trying to take it away and for what purpose? So to give you a small example, when Elizabeth Warren said she wanted to impose a tax on millionaires, she said it was 2 cents out of every whatever dollar over $50 million. And she would say it like it was just a little amount, just 2 cents, just such a small amount. Then we could think of all the things we could pay for, just 2 cents. I think that's the wrong way of talking. Because I think if we want to take their money away because they're too rich, and I think they are, we should want to take a lot of it, not just 2 cents, take a lot of it away. Not because we need their money, but because we want them to have less of it. And in an MMT view, understanding that the point of the tax is not to fund something else, but to take money away, means that in the same time, you might want to tax certain people a lot less. Maybe poor people don't need to be taxed at all. But you also might want to tax other people a lot more. If I don't want there to be billionaires, I don't need to talk about a 2 cent tax. I can just say I want to tax at 100%. Everybody above a certain income. And what you would hear in the 1980s is, if you do that, there will be less billionaires, which means there will be less taxes. And that means you will have less revenue to spend. The Ronald Reagan economist Art Laffer famously said there was a curve where if you try to tax people too much, you don't get as much revenue. In my view, that's fine. I don't want them to have the money in the first place. I don't care if it has 0 revenue. If I have a tax on doing something, I want it to stop happening. And then the other thing that it tells you about taxes is not all taxes are equal. So if I tax $100 from one person and $100 from another person, if one of those people is Bill Gates and the other person only has $100 in their entire life, that will have a very different effect on the economy. So if I am worried about the inflationary effect of spending and taxes, I cannot just look at the taxes in terms of the dollar amounts. If somebody said to me, I have a tax, it'll get us $10 billion. Is that good for inflation? I don't know, because I need to know who it's taxing and for what. But when we think of it just in terms of numbers, we don't look at those questions. We just look at it in terms of dollars. Oh, we got 10 billion. That means we can spend 10 billion. I think that's a mistake.
There are more questions here, but I think unfortunately we are out of time. Maybe you guys can email to Professor Gray to ask more questions. But finally, is there anything you'd like to want to say to the audience or law school students?
Yeah, take money seriously, and please get involved. We have a community of international people who want to learn together. A lot of law students who are interested in these issues. Have a look at the Law Political Economy project at Yale. They are doing really good work connecting these issues with other issues around law and political economy. I'd also say that in the same way, if you're going to law school, you understand that it's important to understand the technicalities of law. Obviously, politics are very important. I don't need to tell you that. But you understand that to be a good lawyer, you need to be able to understand the law as a system. Well, unfortunately, the same is true of money. And money has a legal part, it has an economic part, and it has a technological part. And in the world today, you cannot understand money without understanding that there is technology, there is political economy, and there is law. And it's a lot of expertise to try to juggle. But if you want to give good advice to your clients and you want to make good policy in the world and you want to actually be the best kind of lawyer to see the future and help make the future happen, in my view, those three areas, law, money, and technology, are where the power lies. And the more you can do to understand those systems, the better you will be as someone who can make change as a lawyer.
I think that's it. Now it's time to sum up our webinar. Thanks for sharing your time with us. It was a great honor to invite you and to learn about money and law.
Thank you for having me. I hope it wasn't too unclear. Love to come back at any time. I hope it was of help. Please keep in touch.
Yeah, see ya.
Bye.
Thank you.